Christmas, 1916. A terminally ill millionaire enters his new palace, but instead of a celebration, he is met with chaos. The paint on the walls is still wet, and workers are carrying out their tools at the last minute. He has spent a fortune in a desperate race against death. For this day, 1,000 people, a tenth of the entire county's population, battled malarial swamps. They burned jungles and drained marshes, and all this to build a perfect lie, a palace designed to look 400 years old from day one. But you're not here for the architecture. We'll show you how an ordinary tractor is connected to one of the most brutal monopolies in American history, and how money squeezed from thousands of ruined farmers was laundered in this paradise. How did a palace built on fear and the sorrow of others become a national treasure? This is Miami, a place where the sun deals in promises and the ocean washes away the past. And in the heart of this endless summer stands a palace, as if lifted from the pages of a European fairy tale. Vizcaya. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people come here to touch a dream. They take selfies against marble columns, pose for wedding photos in its immaculate gardens. They see beauty, harmony, eternity. But this is an illusion, a meticulously staged performance. This is a stage where, every year, hundreds of thousands of people become actors in a play they haven't read, in a set whose true cost they do not know. Because every stone in this wall, every leaf on these trees, is a monument to a man who fled from the world that created him. It is a fortress built on the money of a brutal monopoly, by the will of a recluse who tried to buy himself immortality. Forget for a moment the azure Florida sky. Let's transport ourselves to another world, a world of soot, clamor, and steel. To Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. This is the true source of this paradise, the tireless, smoking factories of the International Harvester Company. Here, in the clang of metal and the sweat of thousands of workers, one of America's greatest industrial empires was forged. An empire that mechanized agriculture and, in the process, brought a whole generation of farmers to their knees. This stucco, gleaming in the sun, was paid for by the rust on their plows. This serene pool reflects not only the sky, but also the ghosts of financial wars, secret deals, and ruined lives. The man who owned this, James Deering, was the crown prince of this industrial power. But he despised it. He saw it as a coarse, ugly force from which he sought to hide behind the walls of his Mediterranean fantasy. He built a palace that was meant to speak of centuries of aristocratic history, but all of its history was bought and shipped across the ocean in just a few years. He created a paradise garden where there were only impenetrable mangrove swamps, teeming with disease. He erected a cathedral to solitude that today has become one of the most photographed landmarks in the world. And therein lies the central paradox of Vizcaya. How could a creation born of fear, loneliness, and money squeezed from the American land manage to outgrow its creator and become a national treasure? How did a palace that was an act of escapism transform into a symbol of luxury and cultural heritage? To understand this ghost in paradise, we must go back to the very beginning, to where its price was forged, to the heart of the corporate battle that changed America. We think we know this picture, a golden field, a farmer in his machine, harvesting his crop. It's an image of American freedom, a symbol of labor rewarded by the fruits of the earth. But that's only half the story. In the early 20th century, the machine that was supposed to free the farmer became his chain, and the man who held the key to that chain was preparing to spend his fortune to build a paradise on earth. It all began with a war. Not one fought in the trenches, but one that had raged for decades across the vast fields of the Midwest. In the newspapers, They called it the Harvester Wars. On one side, the McCormick dynasty, inventors, pioneers. On the other, the Deering clan, shrewd, ruthless industrialists whose heir, James, preferred the silence of offices to the roar of factories. They were titans whose struggle shook the economy. They bled out in price wars, industrial espionage, and patent battles, ruining smaller competitors and each other. By the turn of the 20th century, both giants stood on the edge of an abyss, exhausted and bled dry. And then, the man who tolerates no chaos when his money is at stake entered the stage. The banker of kings and the king of bankers, J.P. Morgan. In 1902, he summoned the warring parties to his offices in New York. It wasn't a request. It was a command. In a cloud of cigar smoke, behind closed doors, he forced them to make peace. But this wasn't peace. It was a surrender to capital. Thus, a monster was born. International Harvester. This was not just a merger. It was a trust that instantly seized 85% of the entire agricultural machinery market in the United States. Competition died that day. On its grave grew a monopoly whose shadow fell over the entire country, from coast to coast. And this monopoly armed itself with a new, sophisticated weapon, a practice known as full-line forcing. A farmer who came to buy a reaper was now told, "You will also buy our plow and our seeder and our wagons, or you will get nothing." It was an ultimatum, economic blackmail that turned free farmers into corporate serfs. Every screw, every nut sold under such pressure was an invisible brick in the wall of James Deering's future palace. His wealth was not simply an inheritance. It was a trophy won in a war where no prisoners were taken. The war was won. The empire was built. The money, drained from the American soil, flowed like a river. Deering possessed a fortune capable of reshaping landscapes and buying history itself. He was a king of the industrial world. But soon, he would receive news that would prove to him that all his gold couldn't buy the one thing that mattered most: time. In a world where money decided everything, James Deering faced an enemy that couldn't be bought out or absorbed in a corporate merger. This enemy was in his own blood, a silent, invisible killer that doctors called pernicious anemia. In the early 20th century, it was a death sentence. His body, cell by cell, was betraying him. The empire of steel and tractors he controlled was powerless. Doctors couldn't offer him a cure, but they offered a reprieve, a chance. The warm, humid air of the South could slow the inexorable decay. And so, Florida, a wild, uncharted territory, ceased to be just a dot on the map. It became his final bet in a game against death. This was not a choice of a winter getaway. It was a choice of battlefield. To understand what he decided to build on this field, one must understand who he was. James Deering was a paradox, the eminence grise of the Harvester Trust, yet a shy, sickly aesthete. A bachelor who left no heirs, he was surrounded by beauty but doomed to solitude. And more than anything in the world, he despised the very industrial world of Chicago that had made him fabulously wealthy. To him, the smoke from his factories was the stench of ugliness, the roar of machines, the music of vulgarity. Vizcaya was not meant to be just a house. It was meant to be his manifesto, his declaration of independence from his own legacy. Every dollar squeezed from the farmers of the Midwest was now to be laundered in beauty. Every share of stock bought on the verge of their competitor's bankruptcy was to be transformed into a marble statue. He was building his paradise with money from the hell he himself had helped create. The choice of style, Mediterranean Renaissance, was no accident. It was his most audacious move. He wasn't building an American mansion. He was building a European villa that looked as if it had stood on this shore for 400 years. It was a desperate attempt to buy what he never had: history, depth, roots. He was creating the illusion of a centuries-old dynasty while being its final representative. Vizcaya was to be his only heir, the silent witness to his taste and his longing. He declared war on his own mortality. But to build his fortress against time, he had to enter another battle. A battle not with steel and capital, but with mud, disease, and the wild, primordial nature of the American South. Today, the gardens of Vizcaya seem to us the embodiment of harmony. Orderly labyrinths, quiet grottos, statues gazing thoughtfully at the water's surface. It is a triumph of design over the elements. But 100 years ago, there was no harmony here. There was chaos. 180 acres of primordial horror that James Deering bought to build his paradise. This was not a jungle. It was a living, breathing organism that did not want to be disturbed. An impenetrable wall of mangrove thickets, its roots, like gnarled fingers, delving into the salty black water. The air was thick, you could drink it, and it was filled with the buzzing of mosquito clouds carrying malaria. Snakes slithered in the eternal shade beneath poison ivy. This wasn't land, it was an enemy. But James Deering had a weapon capable of defeating any enemy: money. Money that could hire an army. And the invasion began. Thousands of workers, armed with axes and saws, tore into this wall of green. The sound of the wild was replaced by the crash of falling trees and the shouts of men. They chopped, they burned, they uprooted. They waged war against Florida itself. Every swing of an axe was paid for with sweat that dripped into their eyes. Every cubic yard of earth was soaked with the risk of malaria. It was Sisyphean labor. To create solid ground for a European garden, they first had to destroy an ecosystem that had existed here for millennia. The swamps were filled in. The coastline was redrawn at the whim of blueprints. Tons and tons of fertile soil, brought from afar, were laid over the buried jungle. Their sweat and blood became fertilizer for his fantasy. It was an act of absolute conquest, a violation of the landscape, committed with surgical precision and a limitless budget. European geometry versus tropical anarchy. Human will, burning its imprint onto the body of the planet. Deering wasn't just building a house. He was creating a new world on the site of one he deemed imperfect. The swamp was conquered. The land was tamed. The foundation for a dream was laid. But conquering nature was only the first act. Now, a different kind of war began. A war between the men who were to bring this dream to life in stone. A war of ambition, talent, and ego. On paper, it all looked perfect. 3 men, 3 pillars upon which Vizcaya was to rest. James Deering, the patron, a man with a nearly unlimited budget and an idea bordering on obsession. F. Burrell Hoffman, the architect, a talented young graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, capable of translating any fantasy into blueprints. And Paul Chalfin, the artistic director, artist, adventurer, aesthete, Deering's right-hand man and, as it soon turned out, the true demiurge of this world. It was supposed to be an alliance of geniuses, but it turned into a battlefield. The triumvirate became a triumvirate of egos. Their correspondence, preserved in the archives, is not a chronicle of collaboration, but the minutes of an endless war for control. Hoffman, the architect, believed in logic, in the laws of proportion, in building codes. He created plans based on mathematics and common sense, but his blueprints would return with notes in Deering's red pencil and caustic comments from Chalfin. Too modern, not authentic enough. It has no soul. They demanded the impossible from him. To build a 20th century building with 20th century technology that looked as if it were 400 years old. Every beam, every doorway became a subject of fierce debate. Hoffman was building a house. They were creating a myth. And the chief myth maker was Paul Chalfin. He was more than a designer. He was the production designer. It was he who convinced Deering to abandon the idea of an American estate and to aim for a European palazzo. It was he who spent years in Italy and Spain, buying up not just furniture, but entire rooms, ceilings, and fireplaces, which were then fitted into the body of Vizcaya like pieces of a puzzle. He wasn't decorating interiors. He was filling them with stolen souls. Chalfin saw himself not as an employee, but as a co-author, an artist, equal to his patron. He argued with Deering over the shade of a marble, the placement of a doorway, the height of a ceiling. He tolerated no compromises. His task was to create a flawless illusion, and he was willing to sacrifice everything for it: the budget, the deadlines, and the architect's nerves. This wall is not just a wall, he would declare. It is a testament to a fictional era. This fireplace is not just a fireplace, it is the heart of the room, which had been beating for centuries. In this battle of three wills, the face of Vizcaya was born. It was an agonizing, conflict-ridden process. Every arch is the result of an argument. Every column is a compromise, torn from hours of debate. The building that was meant to be a symbol of serenity was constructed in an atmosphere of constant tension. Three men were creating their ideal world, but they forgot about those by whose hands it was actually being built, about the 1,000-strong army of nameless builders, for whom Vizcaya was not a dream, but a sentence of hard labor. We know the names of Vizcaya's creators: Deering, the client; Chalfin, the visionary; Hoffman, the architect. Their names are etched in history. But who actually built this palace? Whose hands chiseled the coral stone under the scorching sun? Whose backs bent under the weight of Italian marble? Who mixed the mortar that bound this fantasy together? At the peak of construction, an army worked here, more than 1,000 people. To understand the scale, you have to imagine the Miami of that time, a tiny, sleepy town on the edge of the swamps. That 1,000-strong workforce made up 10% of the entire county's population. Vizcaya wasn't just a construction site. It was a state within a state, with its own laws and its own price for a human life. It was a motley army. Locals, accustomed to the heat, but not to such grueling labor. Skilled artisans, brought over from Europe to recreate antique carvings and moldings. But the core, the cheapest and most disenfranchised labor force, was made up of immigrants. Hundreds of people who had arrived on boats from the Bahamas in search of a better life. They didn't find it. They found back-breaking labor. The conditions were hellish. A 12-hour workday under the merciless Florida sun, suffocating humidity from which there was no escape. They lived in primitive barracks built right there, on the swamps. Malaria, carried by mosquitoes, cut them down in droves. Workplace injuries were commonplace. Falls from scaffolding, mutilation from tools, heat stroke. How many of them died here? We will never know the exact number. There is no room for such stories in Vizcaya's official chronicles. The death of a common laborer was not an event worthy of mention in the correspondence of gentlemen discussing the shade of plaster. They were cogs in the giant machine that created beauty. Expendable material. Every flawless arch of this ceiling holds the echo of their cough. Every cool tile on the floor remembers the heat of their bodies. This building, which today mesmerizes us with its elegance, was built with brute force and desperation. This is a story they don't tell the tourists. The story of how the foundation of any paradise is almost always built on human suffering. The army of the nameless completed its task. They conquered the swamp, erected the walls, and created the stage for a one-man show. And at the same time, thousands of miles away, in war-torn Europe, another man, Paul Chalfin, was waging his own campaign. He was hunting for the scenery for this theater. He was hunting for the past. While thousands of workers battled nature in Florida, another war was raging in Europe. The First World War. The continent was bleeding, empires were collapsing, the world was changing forever. But for one man, Paul Chalfin, this tragedy was an opportunity. Armed not with a rifle, but with James Deering's checkbook, he journeyed into the heart of the chaos on an unprecedented hunt. His trophies were not to be lands, but centuries. He was a hunter of the past. His mission, to buy an American nouveau riche, a history he could not inherit. He scoured the impoverished palazzos of Venice, the dusty villas of Tuscany, the castles of Spain. Aristocratic families, bankrupted by the war, were willing to sell anything. And Chalfin bought. He didn't just buy an antique chair or a tapestry. He bought in bulk. Imagine it. He would walk into an ancient palace, point his finger, and say, "I'll take this ceiling." A carved, painted, 16th century ceiling that had witnessed generations of a noble family. It was carefully dismantled, plank by plank, packed, and prepared for shipment. "I want this fireplace." A massive marble fireplace that had warmed doges and cardinals. It was pried from the wall. These gates. 15th century wrought iron gates that remembered the hoofbeats of knights' horses. This wasn't shopping. It was a surgical operation to extract the very soul of old Europe. And each such operation created a logistical nightmare. It was 1915. The Atlantic was teeming with German U-boats. Any ship could become their victim. And so, in the midst of this deadly game, vessels laden with thousands of tons of priceless history sailed across the ocean. Every crate with a dismantled ceiling, every statue, every fragment of marble flooring, all of it was insured for colossal sums. It was the most expensive and risky shipment of antiques in history. Some of the deals were borderline illegal. Officials in Italy responsible for preserving cultural heritage turned a blind eye, bribed by American gold. What today would be called plunder was then considered a display of good taste and great means. Chalfin wasn't just buying artifacts. He was conducting a special operation to expropriate European memory. And so, these fragments of the past, these stolen memories, arrived in Miami. They were met not by European cobblestones, but by the mud and swamps of a construction site. And here, the most difficult stage began. How to assemble a unified whole from this chaos of disparate foreign elements. How to make stone from Verona speak the same language as plaster from Florida. How to create the illusion that all of this was born and had lived here for centuries. The antiques arrived. The precious fragments of old Europe were unloaded on the Florida shore. But now the builders faced their most complex, almost alchemical task. How to make the new become old. How to teach fresh concrete to lie about its age. How to create the illusion that this palace was not built in 2 years, but had slowly grown over 4 centuries. What began next was not construction. It was theater. Vizcaya became the stage for the greatest historical mystification. Paul Chalfin, the director of this performance, demanded absolute authenticity. He understood that an ancient ceiling from a palazzo would look out of place attached to a perfectly smooth new wall. The wall had to be infected with time. And so they began. Plasterers, Instead of smoothing surfaces, deliberately created bumps and cracks, imitating the settling of a building over many years. Artists took up their brushes, and instead of frescoes, they painted, mold. They applied dark, greenish stains to the fresh plaster in places where leaks might have appeared over time. Every brushstroke was calculated to deceive the eye. The marble floors, just laid, looked too new, too glossy. They needed to be aged. Workers took sand and ground the stone for hours, dulling the shine, creating scuffs, as if generations of invisible owners had walked here for centuries. New wooden beams were treated with special tools, leaving wormholes and scratches on them. Some elements were intentionally damaged. A corner of a step was chipped. A door jamb was scratched. It was the magic of destruction in the name of creation. Every nail, every doorknob had to fit the legend. If a certain element couldn't be bought in Europe, it was created in workshops right on site, but using ancient techniques. And then it was artificially aged, so it wouldn't stand out against the authentic artifacts. Vizcaya is a masterpiece in the art of deception. It proclaims its noble age, but almost every word it speaks is a lie. It is a symphony of falsehood, performed with brilliant precision. Here, even time is just another building material, as pliable as plaster or clay. But behind this facade, behind this 400-year-old mask, lay another, much deeper secret. The true ghost of the 20th century, hiding in the very bowels of this Renaissance palace, the spirit of the machine that set this entire, meticulously constructed illusion in motion. On the outside, Vizcaya speaks the language of the 16th century, the language of stone, wood, and wrought iron. But within its walls, the spirits of the 20th century dwell like ghosts. This was the project's central conflict, the main secret to be hidden from view. How to reconcile Renaissance aesthetics with industrial reality. How to bring the comforts of the modern era into an ancient palazzo without destroying the magic of the past. James Deering was not building a museum. He was building a home to be lived in. And the life of an industrial magnate in 1916 demanded technology. He wanted not just fireplaces, but central heating. He wanted not candles, but electric lighting. He needed elevators, telephones, hot water at the turn of a tap, and even a futuristic marvel like a central vacuum system. And so, engineers faced a task akin to a watchmaker trying to fit a steam engine into a pocket watch. The entirety of Vizcaya was threaded with a network of pipes, wires, and ducts, like a circulatory system. In the basements, its own power plant hummed, the heart of this mechanical beast. But all of this had to remain invisible. Technology had to serve without announcing its presence. It was a game of hide and seek on a level of engineering genius. Where do you place heating radiators in a hall adorned with priceless tapestries? They were hidden behind ornate wrought iron grills, disguised as decorative elements. How do you run wiring to a chandelier in a room with a painted ceiling brought from Venice? The wires were pulled through specially cut channels, which were then meticulously patched and aged by artists. The most incredible marvel was the central vacuum system. In each room, usually near the baseboard, there was a small opening covered by a bronze cap. A maid would simply connect a hose to it, and a powerful pump in the basement would suck up the dust through a network of pipes hidden in the walls. No noise, no bulky equipment in the formal rooms. Pure magic. Vizcaya is the perfect metaphor for James Deering himself. On the outside, an aristocratic facade, a refined aesthete, a collector of European antiquities, and on the inside, a cold, calculating mechanism, the industrial power that drives all this beauty. He created a palace that, like himself, lived a double life, hiding its true modern nature under the mask of a bygone era. And nowhere was this dualism more apparent than in the strangest and most symbolic structure of the entire estate, in the solitary stone figure, frozen in the waves of the bay. If you look at Vizcaya from the water, the first thing that catches your eye is not the palace itself. It's a strange, almost surreal object, frozen 100 feet from the shore. A stone barge. It resembles the skeleton of a sunken ship, an ancient sarcophagus washed into the shallows. It seems alien, illogical, almost insane. What is it? Why is it here? On the simplest, most utilitarian level, it's a breakwater, an engineering structure designed to protect the fragile shoreline and boat basin from the fury of ocean storms. But in the world of Deering and Chalfin, nothing was simply utilitarian. Every necessity had to be cloaked in the form of a poetic fantasy. They couldn't just build a concrete wall in the sea. That would have been too crude, too modern. So they created this hybrid, a sculpture pretending to be an engineering structure, or an engineering structure pretending to be a sculpture. It was adorned with grotesque figures of sea monsters and nymphs, like a fragment of sunken Atlantis raised from the depths. But this stone barge had another, more important role. It was a stage. On moonlit evenings, guests were brought by boat to this artificial island. Lanterns were lit, music played. Here, in the middle of the bay, under the stars, the most exquisite receptions were held. It was the pinnacle of theatricality, a party on ruins that never existed. And yet, its main purpose was neither protection nor entertainment. It was symbolic. Let's recall that the main symbol of Vizcaya, repeated everywhere from the weather vane to the stained glass windows, is the caravel, the ship of explorers like Vasco da Gama, after whom the bay was named, Biscay, or in Spanish, Vizcaya. James Deering, an industrialist from Chicago, saw himself as just such an explorer. He arrived in these wild lands to found his own civilization. This stone barge is his personal caravel. Motionless, rooted to the seabed, it symbolizes the end of his journeys. He dropped anchor here. He found his promised land. It is a monument to his arrival, his conquest, a frozen ship on the shores of a man-made world, created by his will. He conquered the swamp. He raised the walls. He dropped anchor in the bay. The battle with inanimate nature was won. But now another, longer, and more grueling war was beginning. A war with living nature, with the untamable riot of tropical flora, which he attempted to confine within the strict framework of a European garden. The house was almost ready. The walls were up, the roof was in place. But James Deering knew that a palace without a garden is a body without a soul, and the garden he envisioned was to be more than just a park. It was to be an extension of his theater, another stage where the main actor would be nature itself, forced to play by his rules. For this task, another genius was invited, the young landscape architect Diego Suarez. He was given a seemingly impossible assignment: to impose the strict, symmetrical geometry of the French and Italian Baroque on the lush, chaotic flesh of the tropics. This was an attempt to make palm trees grow in formation and vines weave along perfectly calculated lines. Suarez created more than just a garden. He designed an enfilade of green rooms, each with its own character and drama. Here is the secret garden, a secluded space hidden behind high walls, intended for quiet contemplation. Here is the theater garden, where cascades of water and hedges create wings for imaginary performances. And here is the labyrinth, a classic European attraction where one could get lost just a few steps from the house. This was a philosophy of absolute control. Every bush was trimmed, Every flower bed had its shape. Every path led to a predetermined viewpoint. There was no room for chance. This was not a dialogue with nature, but a dictate. Man spoke, and the plants had to obey. But the tropics do not listen to orders. And here began the endless, exhausting war that continues to this day. A war that is impossible to win. The soldiers in this war were dozens of gardeners who, from dawn till dusk, fought an enemy advancing from all sides. The first enemy was growth. Plants in Florida's humid climate grew at a monstrous rate. A perfectly trimmed hedge would turn into a shaggy beast in a week. Weeds broke through the marble paths with indomitable force. The garden constantly tried to break out of its geometric cage, to return to its primitive, wild state. The second enemy was humidity. It bred fungus and mold that devoured the delicate European flowers brought here on the client's whim. The third, pests, hordes of insects for whom this oasis of manicured greenery was a feast. The gardens of Vizcaya are a living organism in constant resistance. It is a monument to human perseverance and at the same time, human hubris. Every perfectly straight line here is the result of a daily, hourly struggle. A struggle that James Deering watched with growing impatience. His own time was running out, and he gave his builders an ultimatum. He wanted to celebrate Christmas in his new home. The race against death was entering its final stage. Time. The one resource James Deering could not control. His health deteriorated with each passing month. The doctors gave grim prognoses, and the desperate desire to see his creation completed turned into an obsession. He could wait no longer. He announced that he would arrive in Miami for Christmas, 1916, and he would live in his house, whether it was ready or not. For the builders, this news sounded like a battle alarm. The last few months turned into a frantic, feverish race. Hundreds of workers toiled day and night by the light of electric lamps. The sound of hammers and saws never ceased. They had to finish at least the main rooms to make the house livable. Furniture, still smelling of the ship's hold, was unpacked and placed in rooms where the paint had not yet dried. Tapestries were hung on walls that still emanated dampness. It was organized chaos. And then, on December 25th, a silhouette appeared on the horizon. The elegant, snow-white yacht, Nepenthe. On board was the master. James Deering had arrived. He stepped ashore and for the first time entered not a construction site, but his home. We can only imagine the scene. He stands in the middle of the vast courtyard, surrounded by scaffolding and construction debris. But he no longer sees chaos, but a finished masterpiece. He walks through halls where workers are clearing away their tools at the last moment. He sees his fireplace from an Italian palazzo, with a fire lit in it for the first time. He hears his footsteps echo loudly in the still empty corridors. That evening, the first dinner was held at Vizcaya. Modest by future standards, but for Deering, it was a triumph. He sat at the table in his enormous, not yet fully furnished hall, and perhaps for the first time in years, he felt that he had won. He had won. He had outrun death. He had built his fortress against time and managed to enter it. The house was ready. The stage was set. The most expensive, most exquisite, most thought-out stage that money could buy. Only one problem remained. In this grand theater, there was almost no audience. The performance for which all this was created was in danger of never beginning. Everyone expected Vizcaya to become the new center of attraction for America's high society, that its halls would be filled with laughter, music, and the sparkle of diamonds, that here, under the Florida palms, a southern branch of Fifth Avenue would emerge. But it never happened. Contrary to all expectations, The most luxurious palace on the coast became the most secluded monastery. James Deering built his stage, but he did not like an audience. Vizcaya was not for others. It was for him. It was his refuge, his fortress of solitude. He spent only a few winter seasons here, and for most of that time, he was alone. Picture this scene. Evening. A dining room as vast as a cathedral, designed for dozens of guests. A long table, set for one. And at the head of this table sits James Deering, a quiet, sickly man, dining in complete silence under the gaze of portraits of European nobility that he bought along with their history. 17 servants move silently through the house, keeping this sleeping giant alive. Their footsteps are the only sound in the empty halls. Sometimes, the silence was broken by music. In the living room stood a massive organ, a marvel of engineering. Deering could sit alone for hours, listening as the powerful, solemn chords of Bach or Wagner filled the space, echoing off the marble walls and tapestries. Music was his only companion. It spoke of greatness and tragedy, filling this magnificent emptiness with emotion. Of course, there were guests, but their visits were rare, meticulously planned events that only emphasized the general lifelessness. The great painter John Singer Sargent spent several weeks here, working on a portrait of Deering. The silent film star Lillian Gish stayed at Vizcaya, enchanted by its surreal beauty. But these were just brief interludes in a long play about loneliness. Vizcaya was the perfect set, but it had no life. Children's laughter never echoed within these walls. There were no family quarrels and reconciliations here. It was a golden cage that its creator built for himself. He achieved his goal, creating a world of absolute, controlled beauty. But in this world, he became a prisoner. He won the race against time, but perhaps lost something more important. He built a house, but never found a home. He created a monument to his taste, but this monument was silent. He thought he was building a fortress to hide from death, but he failed to consider that the greatest threat would come not from within his body, but from the outside, from the sea and from the sky. Fate is the greatest of playwrights, and it prepared a finale for Vizcaya's story that was full of cruel irony. James Deering, the man who spent a fortune to build the perfect place to live, and perhaps to die, did not die in his palace. He did not breathe his last in a luxurious canopy bed, watching the sunset over his man-made paradise. In 1925, while returning from another trip to Europe, he died as he perhaps wished he had lived, at sea, aboard the steamship City of Paris, in the middle of the boundless ocean. His body, having lost its final battle, was brought to a land to which he could never truly belong. He never saw his gardens in their full, completed splendor. The man who tried to control everything was powerless in the face of the final act. His creation, his sole heir of stone and marble, was orphaned. It seemed as if Vizcaya was frozen in time, transformed into a silent monument to its creator. But nature had other plans, as if the heavens, angered by the audacity of a man who decided to reshape the earth in his own image, chose to strike back. Exactly 1 year after Deering's death, in September of 1926, a monster came from the Atlantic, the Great Miami Hurricane. This was not just a storm. This was an apocalypse. The wind, blowing at over 150 miles per hour, roared like a primeval beast. The ocean, heaving in a 15-foot wall of water, crashed down upon the coast. Vizcaya, standing right on the shore, took the full fury of the elements. The main house, built like a fortress, withstood it. But everything that was fragile, everything that was alive, was destroyed. 10 years of painstaking work by the gardeners were wiped from the face of the earth in a single night. The gardens, Deering's pride, were turned into a churned mess of mud, uprooted trees, and salt water. The elegant statues were toppled, the fountains shattered, and the stone barge, his symbol of conquering the sea, was mutilated. The waves it was meant to hold back broke it apart, tearing off the carved figures and carrying them into the abyss. The dream that had outlived its creator now stood on the brink of ruin. Nature, which Deering had so diligently tried to tame, showed who the real master was here. It seemed like the end. The magnificent, but now crippled and unwanted fantasy was doomed to a slow decay and oblivion. But it was at this moment of complete despair that the story of Vizcaya took its most unexpected turn. Ruined and orphaned, Vizcaya was an unbearable burden. James Deering's heirs, his nieces, faced a harsh reality. Maintaining this stone colossus, restoring its gardens, required a fortune. The very fortune that was melting away in the fires of the Great Depression. They began selling off the land around the estate, acre by acre, just to pay the taxes. Their uncle's dream had become a liability. And then, on the verge of total collapse, the greatest paradox of this story occurs. In 1952, the heirs sell Vizcaya to Dade County. They sell it for the symbolic sum of $1 million, with a single but crucial condition. This palace, created as the most elite and private place on earth, must become a public museum, open to all. At that moment, a private fantasy dies, only to be reborn as a public treasure. The golden cage, built by a recluse with monopoly money, throws open its gates. And a miracle happens. Vizcaya, having lost its king, finds a new life, far more vibrant and significant than the one for which it was created. Its empty halls fill with voices, no longer those of servants, but of thousands of ordinary people who come here to witness a marvel. Its gardens become the stage for historic events that Deering could never have dreamed of. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan welcomes Pope John Paul II here. Two worlds, two powers, meet in a setting created by an industrial magnate from Chicago. It is also here that Reagan holds talks with Mikhail Gorbachev, deciding the fate of the world against a backdrop of fake European ruins. Vizcaya becomes a star. It appears in Hollywood blockbusters, from Iron Man to Bad Boys, becoming a recognizable pop culture symbol. It becomes what it never was during its creator's lifetime, a living, breathing, essential place. James Deering fled from the world, but it was the world that saved his legacy. He built a monument to himself, but that monument only survived when it no longer belonged to him. He wanted to buy himself immortality, and in a way, he succeeded, but not in the way he had planned. In the end, the most enduring thing James Deering built was not of stone, but of myth. A myth of power, beauty, and loneliness. A myth that even a creation born of egoism and fear can find redemption by becoming part of a shared history. And this is the myth that we come here to retell. Again and again and again. And so, a myth is born. A creation, born of egoism and fear, finds redemption only when it ceases to belong to its creator. Vizcaya, conceived as a fortress for one, became a treasure for all, proving that true immortality is not what we build for ourselves, but what we leave behind. But does beauty, whose foundation is built on suffering, have a right to exist? And can we today, knowing the price of this paradise, admire it without a shadow of a doubt?
Hold it right there, perfect.
This story has no single correct reading, and we would be glad if you shared your own in the comments. Support our channel if complex stories like this resonate with you, And together, we will continue to search for the ghosts that live in the most beautiful places on Earth.